My guest today is Charles Cho, General Counsel of New South Wales Treasury. Charles heads up the Office of the General Counsel, as well as being a member of the New South Wales Treasury Executive Leadership Team. I'm really excited to speak with Charles today about the critical role that government has had in moderating the economic impact of the pandemic and also sustaining the recovery moving forward. Thank you for joining me, Charles.
All right, good to be here.
The past few months has seen the enormous initiative by New South Wales Government with their health and economic stimulus packages to respond immediately to the crisis and also to help with the recovery. Can you share what this has meant for you and your legal team?
So as a legal team advising the Treasurer's Office on New South Wales Government response to COVID-19, we've been enormously busy alongside our Treasury colleagues advising on the various policy responses to COVID-19. So some of the key highlights have been advising the Treasurer's Office on the legal basis for some of the stimulus packages, rapidly putting in place contracts for the quarantining of incoming international passengers that required my team to work closely with New South Wales Procurement to put in place accommodation contracts with all the hotel providers, advising on procurement for personal protective equipment across the sector. We're also advising on legislative changes to the financial management legislation to accommodate a deferral of the budget from June to late this year. And finally, and probably one of the most difficult things was to advise on changes to allow for relief for residential and commercial leases.
12 months ago, you presented at the Legal Innovation and Tech Fest in Sydney on the topic of public value. And at that time, you called on corporates to look at how they could further their contribution to the greater good. Since the onset of the pandemic, all levels of government in Australia have really stepped up. And I think that trust in government is really at an all-time high at the moment. What does this mean for the private sector and its role in society?
I think the COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally changed people's perception of the role of government in society alongside the private sector. People's sense of security, of having a job and having a place to live have been shaken. When large amounts of people have lost their jobs so suddenly and are worried about paying their mortgages or paying their rent, what they found was that when they didn't have a job, it was only government that could step in to help. And I think, the good times we've had over the last 2 decades, the good economic prosperity, has, I guess, shielded what people's perception of government's role in society is. I think in the good times, government is there to support the private sector and to have regulations which regulate competition and safety and things like that. But I think in the current crisis, there's been a dawning realization that actually government is very important and sometimes only government can do things which the private sector can't. I also think that trust has stemmed from how successful both the federal and state governments have been in managing the crisis. Fortunately, Australia has been a lot more proactive and successful than other countries, and that I think has engendered trust. And I think that experience is going to fundamentally reshape the dual roles that the private sector and the government have in going forward, I think.
Government and private companies alike are now moving on from the survival phase and looking to economic recovery. What role will both the government and private sectors play in that?
At Treasury, our 3 phases to the COVID-19 pandemic has been response, recovery, and reform. Most of the recent activities have been focused on response, which is to save lives and to save jobs. We're now moving into the recovery phase and followed up by a reform phase. And I think it's going to be critical for the public and private sector to work together on that. In the recovery phase, the focus will be about how governments can support those industries which will rapidly allow for jobs to be created, jobs that were lost during the COVID-19 crisis. We don't want government to be employing people. I know during the Great Depression in some countries, government hired people to dig holes and fill holes. That's not what we want. We want to be creating jobs which are sustainable. We want to be creating jobs which are going to reflect the needs of, I guess, society going into the future. And so private sector is going to be vital for that. And the question is, how can government support the private sector in the recovery phase? The third phase, which is the reform phase, is really exciting to me, because there's been a lot of really hard reforms which have been sitting on the shelves, but which before this crisis, I think we would have said that would have been difficult to implement. But they're back on the table. Things like tax reform, harmonizing vocational training. So the federal government just recently announced, as part of their Job Maker initiative, that they want to work with the states in streamlining and having a nationally consistent vocational training platform. That's really important. That's been something that's needed to be reformed for a long time. And this crisis actually presents an opportunity where private sector can indicate to government, what are the vocations of the future? What are the areas that they need most amount of training, and for government to respond and to provide those training facilities through TAFE and through other vocational institutions. The other thing is, because of COVID-19, there's been a number of emergency legislation to cut red tape and to do things which otherwise we might not have passed legislation for. Most of these have been temporary for 6 months, an example being able to execute documents remotely. The federal government recently amended the allow for the Corporations Act execution of contracts under Section 127. People have been asking for that for many, many years. It took this crisis to get that across the line. And one of the important things is, well, how do we make something that is temporary more permanent to help with productivity? Because productivity will lead to greater jobs, which is, I think, the focus of government at the moment.
I know from previous conversations that your team is really important to you, and you're lucky to have such an exceptional legal team. With the pandemic and everything that's happening, you're now tasked with having to do even more without necessarily any additional resources. What strategies have you developed to solve for this?
With COVID-19, there's no doubt my team is working harder than before. And probably the defining feature of the work that we've been doing in the last few weeks and months has been the number of advices that we had to give in an incredibly short time frame, sometimes with incomplete information. When the consequences of your advice is that it affects policy decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars and affects the lives of everyday citizens, it can be a bit daunting. But I think my team has risen to the challenge, which is great. Really, what I've said to the team and try to motivate the team is, what they're doing is important. What they're doing affects society, and there's really meaning in their work. How has my team dealt with the increased workload and the increased pace of things? The metaphor that I've given to my team and also to my clients is that my legal team are like the first responders. So we come in usually on an urgent basis and we triage the problem. If we can deal with it on the spot, we do. However, we need to recognize that at times we need to bring in the specialists for the more complex, time-consuming work. And so this is where we engage with the Crown solicitor or engage a private sector law firm to help us. It's that identification of what we can triage and not being so focused on one matter that allows us to, I guess, balance the work. Technology and also the use of contractors has also helped. For example, each of my managers gets a weekly report from the Lawcadia platform showing on a weekly basis the number of matters that each of my lawyers has opened and have closed, so that we keep a track of the spread of work and also the workload on each of the lawyers.
It really sounds like there's a lot of exceptional teamwork happening within your team, but also you're able to draw on other resources as well. So whether that's some contractors or those other specialist lawyers in your network, it sounds like that's been really, really critical.
A lot of the private sector law firms have stepped up and have offered to do work on a pro bono basis, or have come to me and said, how can we help, particularly given the impacts of COVID and the enormous workload on the public sector. So, they've been very, very helpful in sort of helping us on a number of fronts.
What advice or words of support would you offer to other general counsel and legal teams right now?
I think the greatest challenge for general counsels right now, and it's not, I think, restricted to general counsels, but all executives, is to look after the well-being of our staff. Lawyers by nature are hard workers. And in a recent survey that we did, one of the issues identified was that our lawyers found it hard to maintain the work-personal divide when working from home. I heard from one law firm that who has staff working from home that April was one of their best billing months ever. I see also that in my team, they're working harder than ever, but the flip side of people being more, quote unquote, being productive is that risk of burnout. So making sure you look after your team is very important. What we've instituted is a video conference every morning with the entire team. And each of my managers also checks in with each one of my team members every day. And we once had a situation where we didn't meet for a VC one morning, and everybody felt lost a little bit. It was so important to have that connection as a team, and so maintaining their well-being is important. For the other general counsels out there, I also think that the recovery and reform phase, which I talked about, is going to bring great opportunity for them to work on once in a generation changes to society. The post-COVID-19 work, business and regulatory environment will not be the same. And I think government and private sector businesses will need sound legal advice to help them navigate through it.
Thank you so much, Charles. I really appreciate your time today. And as always, I just find you so insightful, and actually it's really inspiring and invigorating to hear some of those really positive thoughts for the future. Thank you.
No, thank you.